Hello, everybody, and welcome to our gene webinar, COVID-19, about living evidence and guidelines for COVID-19. Sorry, we had some technical problems, so we started a little bit with a little bit of a delay. My name is Pablo Alonso. Hopefully, you can hear me. I'm a researcher at the American Cochrane Center. I'm also a member of the Gene Board of Trustees. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time and in these difficult times for joining us today. So we really hope that you enjoy this third webinar of this series, and we really encourage your participation. However, at the beginning, everybody's in listen-only mode. However, you will be able to raise your hand if you want to speak up, or you can also leave your questions using the question panel on the right-hand side of your screen. This session is expected to last about 9 minutes. There will be time for questions at the end. And also after each of the three speakers, there will be also time for some burning questions if you have any. Just a few words about GENE for those who are not familiar with it. The vision is trustworthy and accessible guidance for better health. And the mission is to lead and strengthen and support collaboration and work with the guideline development, adaptation, and implementation community. We provide a very strong and comprehensive network, and we also have several partnerships with different organizations. And we assist, our main goal is to assist members in reducing duplication of effort also. We also promote best practice through the development of opportunities for learning and building capacity through working groups, participation in our working groups, regional communities, but also conferences. So if you're still a member and if you're interested, please do join us. I would like also to bring your attention about the GENE COVID resources webpage that we have put together and is regularly updated. The seminar will be recorded and uploaded here too. Let me first introduce the speakers, and we are really delighted about the three that we have today. First speaker will be Julian Elliott. He is the lead of evidence systems at Cochrane and executive director of the Australian National COVID-19 Clinical Evidence Taskforce, chair of the Australian Living Evidence Consortium, and he's also the co-founder of and CEO of Coevidence, that you're most likely familiar with. Britta Tendal is passionate about evidence-based medicine and guidelines for quite a while already. And she heads at the moment in Australia, she's the head of the guidelines program for the Australian National COVID-19 Clinical Evidence Taskforce. And our last speaker is Laine. She's general internist and the editor-in-chief of Annals of Internal Medicine and senior vice president of the American College of Physicians. We're going to show you for a few seconds here the declaration of interest of the speakers, so you can have a look. They're all very much related with the background of the three of them, and just a brief outline of the three talks that we have today. First, Julian will talk about the living evidence model, the rationale, and their experience. And then Britta will talk about their application of the model for COVID-19 in Australia. And Christine will speak more from the publication side about the experience in the journal, the Annals of Internal Medicine, with living reviews and guidelines. Okay, so without further delay, I'm going to, Julian, you're going to share your screen. I'm going to make you the presenter, and hopefully you will be able to show the slides.
Thank you, Pablo. Can you just make me the presenter again? Okay, that's great, thanks. Excellent, so can everyone see my slides?
Yep.
So thank you very much to Jin for the invitation to talk to all of you today, and thank you to Pablo for the introduction. So I'm just going to set the scene by talking a little bit about living evidence, the model, what we've developed so far and our experience in using that model. So evidence-based practice. This diagram I think is very familiar to all of you, the model in which we use rigorous evidence-based processes to develop systematic reviews under the auspices of a multidisciplinary team that feed through to guideline development groups that then use that, incorporating expert opinion, patient preferences and characteristics to produce clinical practice guidelines, which we use to make better informed decisions. So that, of course, is the model, the schema, perhaps the aspiration. But we know in reality, in day-to-day life of producing guidelines, that we have many, many challenges. These were, I think, very well documented in a report from Australia's National Health and Medical Research Council, but of course have been widely described in many different fora and publications. So the aspects of guideline development that were highlighted in this report were inefficiency, poor quality, lack of capacity, lack of investment in IT, inaccessibility and obsolescence. So, you know, quite a description, but again, I think very familiar to all of you as some of the challenges that we face in our day-to-day work. What we are aware of is that many of these things really coalesce in a challenge that we all have in producing health evidence that is of high quality and up to date with the latest evidence, which I think is a reasonable expectation of our end users and of the community at large. So I think in general, we're often faced as producers, and I think end users are often faced as consumers with this trade-off between very high quality, rigorous, trustworthy forms of evidence and guidance that are often very difficult to keep up to date with the latest research, and so lose currency over time. And of course, in contrast, we have other forms of evidence and guidance which are kind of quick and dirty, as it were, that can often be quite up to date. I think the exemplar, of course, is say a narrative review, but of course, we're well aware of some of the difficulties we can have around the trustworthiness of those evidence products. So we have this trade-off currently and widely throughout evidence-based practice. And a lot of our work is really about trying to break that trade-off so that we get into a situation where, as producers, we are producing high-quality, trustworthy, and up-to-date products for our stakeholders and other end users. So I think this schema of living evidence is another variation of many of the other evidence ecosystem diagrams that I think we've seen over recent years. We like to emphasize reliability, efficiency, and effectiveness. So just very quickly to walk you through this, through the center, you can think of the funnel here as a process of systematic review, moving into the engine room of developing evidence summaries and guideline recommendations. In the living evidence model, we use all the existing workflows and methods that have been developed over the last 30 years. The key difference is really the frequency of updating, enabling these evidence products to be much more up to date with the latest research. So we produce a set of guideline recommendations which are updated as new evidence emerges. We can use multiple mechanisms for disseminating that information, which of course through a whole set of knowledge translation activities, we seek to change clinical practice and policy. And from that, of course, more data are generated, which can then be used in an appropriate way in the synthesis process. course, this model also then can enable us to map the evidence. So through the combination of methodological rigor and currency, we can get a good understanding of what is known and what's not known. And that can be used in research prioritization activities as well. That can then drive new research, which then also feeds into the evidence synthesis process. This diagram is really another variant on that I just want to highlight, that this connection between the development of evidence and guidance and learning health systems. And so I think the key thing here, highlighted in a paper by Jean-Marie Guisse, Chuck Friedman and others, is this connection between critically appraised external evidence and the data that's being generated within a health system. And so living evidence, I think, in some ways creates the conditions for that external evidence to be more readily integrated into the more dynamic data flows that may be existing within learning health systems. So as an opportunity, I think, for bringing these two worlds together. So a lot of our work in this field really began with the concept of living systematic reviews. We published a paper as a kind of concept around this now almost 6 years ago, where we described what living systematic reviews are, essentially saying that this is not about cutting corners. Living systematic reviews adhere to the methodological principles that have been developed to support the systematic review process, and don't make any changes to that core methodology. The key difference is that they are continually updated. So it's really about the frequency of updating that we distinguish a living systematic review. We're often asked, is there a particular frequency that is required for something to be defined as a living systematic review? Our response is really that frequency really should be driven by the needs of the end user. So in some topics where the evidence is moving very quickly, it may make sense actually for that review to be updated very frequently. In other topic areas where perhaps there isn't as much movement in the information that's becoming available, then that frequency could be less frequent. In practice, what we've found is most teams have been running continuous searches and ensuring that they're searching the major bibliographic databases at least once a month, and then non-bibliographic sources around about every 2 to 3 months, certainly for many of our initial pilot projects. What we also defined were the criteria by which we can make decisions about when a living systematic review may be appropriate. And we're very clear that this approach is just one way of addressing the issue of currency for evidence and guidelines, and should be applied certainly in the current phase that we're in which these methods and processes are still being developed, should be applied to topics that are of priority to stakeholders, where there is some remaining low certainty in the evidence, and where there's a expectation of new information becoming available over the period in which the systematic review is going to be kept in living mode. So really what that's saying is it does take effort to establish a living systematic review. We're still very much in a phase of learning how best to do this. And so in doing so, we should apply this approach to those topics where it's going to be of most benefit. And then over 2 or 3 year period, working with a number of groups within Cochrane and external to Cochrane, we developed a number of pilot living systematic reviews, and through the experiences of those pilots have developed some initial guidance for the development of living systematic reviews. It's framed in the context of Cochrane living reviews, but I think is more broadly available. So I think for any of you who are interested in pursuing living systematic reviews, I just encourage you to go to the Cochrane website. You can just search Cochrane living systematic reviews, and you can download this guidance document. It gives you quite a lot of detail. And so we now, I think, are in a situation where we're seeing really quite a significant increase in the number of living systematic reviews being produced, both within Cochrane and outside of Cochrane. So I've just shown there the title for one of the most recent exemplars within Cochrane, which is being co-published with the British Medical Journal with BMJ. And this is, you know, a great example, I think, of a topic in which we've got very high priority for stakeholders, certainly low certainty, and where there's an absolute deluge of new information becoming available. And then outside of Cochrane, Christine will be talking later about the experiences at Annals. But just to note that for a few years there have been some pilot projects, initially with F1000 Research, which has a publication platform very well suited to the versioning of publications, which makes it well suited to living publications. And as I mentioned earlier, also the BMJ is now also moving into the publication of living reviews. Of course, one of the major questions around this approach is feasibility and acceptability. So in those initial pilot projects, we did a qualitative study looking at this, and the summary of our findings, which were published last year, is that participants in the teams who are producing living systematic reviews really highlighted these elements as critical to the conduct of a living review. So having a motivated and well-organized team, and I would just re-emphasize that. I think a lot of the success really comes from very strong project management and having an experienced team. Secondly, the value of technology enablers to improve efficiency. So in many of these projects, there's use of particular software, machine learning, crowdsourcing, etc. All of those things are not essential to establishing a living review, but they can certainly help to improve efficiency, which is important for any review. But when you're running very tight cycles of frequent updates, that can certainly make quite a difference. And reliable and efficient processes that can be sustained over the long term. So again, tight project management with a very clear set of processes that you're running to maintain the review, and with an eye to how you can sustain that over time. Just note that it is absolutely normal and acceptable for the review team to change over time. As we say, running a living review is not a life sentence. So like many other research endeavours, people will join the team, participate for a period, and then leave the team. And that's, I think, quite an important way in sustaining the effort, but also a way of maintaining the institutional memory, as it were, of the team, in contrast to perhaps a more intermittent updating where often a team has dispersed and you need to reform. And on balance, teams felt that there was certainly the potential for saving the net amount of time and effort over the long run, given the difficulties in establishing new teams and doing review updates. These are important factors highlighted by the participants in the study that are important to keep in mind when we're thinking about scaling up this approach. So being clear about roles, processes, and expectations, particularly mapping that to the resources that you have available. So not biting off too much and being very clear about what you will be able to deliver. Again, just to note that people sometimes have a nervousness about, you know, what happens if my grant runs out or we no longer have resources in order to sustain the review. Our response would always be, that's fine. The review can then move out of living mode and back into a kind of conventional updating mode. It's still provided, living mode has still provided value for that period that you've been able to maintain that. The resources and incentives to sustain a living review, of course, are important. This is not no effort and no resources required. It's just more evenly distributed over time. And thinking about the academic incentives are important, and we might touch on that later with Christine's talk and perhaps in the discussion. Use of technology, again, being very clear about which reviews are prioritised for living mode, and publication processes are certainly an important element of feasibility and the scalability, which Christine will go into. So that's really a very brief summary around living systematic reviews. In terms of living guidelines, again, I think the schema here will be very familiar to you. So the current model where we do all this work to do what we call a baseline guideline or a conventional guideline, or we call climbing the mountain. And then when we stop and publish the guideline, of course, new research emerges, and over time, the currency and therefore the reliability of those guidelines decay over time until at some point, of course, we make a decision to update the guideline. In contrast, a living guideline, we have this mode where we are maintaining the guideline in living mode. Note that there's still this initial climbing of the mountain. So the first step in developing a living guideline is doing a conventional baseline guideline development or update so that you have your guideline in the up-to-date state. And then actually before you get to that point, then transitioning into a mode of continuous updating. So using these tight cycles of maintaining your search strategies, updating the underlying living systematic reviews, and then importantly, making decisions about when new information has emerged, which then needs to be presented to a guideline panel. Then that panel making a decision about, given the new information that's become available, whether any changes need to be made to the recommendation. And so, of course, one element of that is maintaining panels over time. It's not that they have to meet necessarily very frequently, but they need to be constituted, remain constituted, and available to meet when new information becomes available. So again, as with living systematic reviews, it's not no effort. There is more effort, but that effort is more evenly distributed over time, or what we call walking across the plateau, as opposed to climbing and descending mountains. And so Britta will talk in a minute about some of the practical aspects of developing and maintaining a living guideline. But just to note that over the last couple of years, working with a group in Australia called the Australian Living Evidence Consortium, where we're working from Cochrane, Australia, with a number of non-communicable disease communities. We've been developing pilot projects in living guidelines. And I think what we've learned from this is that not only can we combine the trustworthiness of rigorous grade-based guidelines with currency, I think there's two other key benefits which we have, I think, highlighted through this work. So first of all, and here I attribute the highlighting of this advantage really to Elliott, who I think was really instrumental in identifying this advantage, which is that in moving into living mode, you really shift naturally to a focus on recommendations rather than the guideline as a monolithic document. So as opposed to conventional updating, where you go through the whole process and often are running evidence reviews across all of the questions and recommendations within a guideline. If you have that established evidence surveillance program, you really are then looking for these signals about when individual guideline recommendations need to be updated, and then are focusing your effort on those recommendations if and when they may need updating, rather than across the whole guideline itself. And so that helps to focus effort, potentially some efficiency gain there, but I think also very satisfactory and pleasing for guideline panels when they know they're really focused on those recommendations where there's newly emerging evidence. And I think the other thing we've found is that in living mode, there's a great opportunity to have a much more dynamic interaction with end users. So it's not a point of, at a point in time where we have some consultation and then we publish the guideline and then it's set for perhaps some years. In a living mode, we can have a much more active interaction with users where they can be giving feedback not only on the guidelines, but also questions that have not yet been answered, important topics or concerns, which can then feed through to the guideline panels and really shape the work of the panel itself. And so then just to note that within that consortium, last year we produced the Living Stroke Clinical Guidelines together with the Australian Stroke Foundation. And so as far as we know, that's the first national living grade-based guidelines. And that's now been in living mode for, I think, getting close to 9 months. Really as an initial demonstration of the feasibility of living guidelines. And I'll hand over now to Britta, who will discuss how we've taken this learning forward into the context of COVID-19.
Thank you, Julian. Let's see if we can get the tech to work as well, huh? All right.
Well, is it working for you then, Britta? Britta?
Yeah, no, it's not. So I'll need to be the presenter, I think. Thank you. Alrighty. Can you see my screen? Isn't that the mandatory question?
Yep.
Good. Brilliant. Thank you so much. Okay, so I'm Britta, and when Julian talked about tight cycles for updating, this is the kind of project that he was talking about. So I'm going to talk to you about the Australian National COVID-19 Clinical Evidence Taskforce, where I'm head of the engine room right now. So what do? We have at this moment in time 29 peak body professional bodies across Australia who are working together to produce guidelines that are evidence-based. And we really hope that this gives a unified voice in how to care for patients with COVID-19. So that's kind of our mission at the moment. And I'm going to dive a little bit into how we do it, and also some of the processes and the practicalities of what we do. So I hope you will find this very interesting. And please, if you have questions, do submit them in the chat. Don't be shy. We'd love to chat with you about questions you might have. Okay, so we have the 29 members, and I couldn't miss a chance to show all the logos off here, so here they are. This is a slightly busy slide, but it's just to show how we have organized the structure of our guideline. So as you can see, we have a lot of panels. I don't know, maybe you can't really read the names of them, but we have 8 panels. And we also have an expert group. Sometimes you need that extra statistical knowledge, or you need a hematologist or something to help in the panels or to help understand some of the analysis. And then it's just really handy to have this pool of people where you have made sure that their conflicts of interest are declared and they're ready to go. So we have those as well. We have our consumer panel, and then we have an array of different panels to care for different types of people and patients. They make guidelines and they make recommendations almost every week. Some of them meet once a week, some of them meet every second week, and then they draft recommendations and they go then to the guideline leadership group. And in the guideline leadership group, they also review them and they make sure that there's consistency across the board and that everything just looks really good. Then they go to the steering committee where the 29 peak bodies are represented, and then they approve them. And then we publish them. So that's kind of the structure of how this is set up. We also have a committee for the conflicts of interest management. And then we have, of course, my brilliant guideline team who produce all the evidence that the panels are using. So that's the basic structure, how we're doing it. As I told you, 29 member organizations might be growing. We have 15 panels in total if you include everything. And over 200 people right now are contributing actively. We have this month, it's our 100-day anniversary, and we are, I think, working on version 14 or something now of the guideline. We have over 50 recommendations, and yeah, that's a lot of work that goes into this every week. So, but we really do love it. Okay, so how does this start? How did we start? We started with some questions, some burning questions that people had, and we are continuously also collecting questions. So you can write them to us. We have a form on the internet, or we get sometimes questions from the panel members. So we're constantly also collecting new questions that people might want answers to. And what do we then do with those questions? So we prioritize them, because the living doesn't necessarily mean that everything needs to be living. So we're quite particular about what needs to be living. It needs to be something that really impacts a lot of people. It needs to be something where you don't really know what to do in your clinical practice. And also there needs to be a likelihood of new evidence emerging. And as you can imagine, for COVID-19, a lot of questions kind of tick that box. For instance, the disease-modifying treatments is a big question for us. And that brings me to my next point of what I've been naming picofication, right? Because the question a clinician asks isn't necessarily in the form of a pico, right? So what you do is you get a treatment question. They say, what treatment should we use? What treatment is effective? And then the first step that we do is we picofy it, right? So we need to figure out what kind of treatments could be good, what should we search for. So right now we have a very broad search going on for disease-modifying treatments. And then we search in different places, right? We search sometimes for systematic reviews, we search for primary studies, and we are also very big fans of the COVID NMA site that our French colleagues have developed. That's really a brilliant site, just to go and compare notes and to see how they assess stuff and did they find the same stuff that we found. So that's really handy. Then once we've done our search and we found our studies, depending on the question, they might be of different designs, then we need to select them and we need to make sure that we are including everything that's relevant. So we're using some tools to do that as well. Then we're using, obviously, a lot of tools to do data extraction. We do risk of bias assessment, and then we do synthesis. And if we're lucky, we can do a meta-analysis, and sometimes we can only do more of a narrative synthesis if the data aren't poolable, right? So that's your standard how you would do your evidence base for a living or for any kind of guideline. Then you have your evidence and you want to go to your recommendations. And so here we're using GRADE, and to do that we are producing the evidence profiles, we're making summaries as well. We are filling out key information tables or evidence to decision tables, and also we provide the rationales for why the decisions or recommendations ended up as they ended up. I call it opening up the black box a little bit so that we try to be as transparent as possible. So, and now comes the point where it really differs from how you maybe make a non-living guideline, and that is your weekly cycle that we have. So every day we have evidence work going on, right? So every day we search for new evidence, every day we appraise it if it comes in, we do our analysis. It's kind of an ongoing work for all of our questions. Then you can see Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday are panel days where the panels are meeting. And the ones that I shaded are the ones that only meet right now twice a week or twice every second week, not twice a week, every second week. And the other ones are meeting right now once a week. This has changed over time. So in the beginning, we had only, I think we started out with 3 panels and they met every week. And then as we kind of got through their questions, then we could go down and only meet every second week because there wasn't that much evidence filtering through. And then we established the special populations panels, and now they're meeting every week because they have a lot of stuff to go through. So it really depends on how much evidence there is for the panels to go through. So it might also change over time that they might not need to meet every week anymore or even every second week. So Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, panels meet, make new recommendations or update existing ones. And then on Friday, we pull it all together into the next version of the guideline. That guideline, that new version, gets then sent to our guideline leadership group. So that's the group that sits across all the panels, make sure that there's consistency across the board, and they then meet on the Monday. And then they go over everything, and they may have some comments, and then we incorporate the comments, and then we send everything to the steering committee on a Tuesday afternoon. And then they meet Wednesday at noontime, and then hopefully they kind of like what they're seeing, and then they have 24 hours to approve. So that's all of the 29 peak bodies then have to approve the guidelines. So we're aiming for full consensus on this. And then hopefully they approve it, and then we publish on the Thursday. Mostly it's in the evening. So, and that's been, going on now for some months that we do that. So you can see it's a quite an intense weekly cycle, and obviously then it repeats every week. So that's kind of how my life looks at the moment. Good. And how do you actually make this happen, and how do you keep making it happen? I just have to give a big shout out to the team. You really need a great team. And yes, I did get their consent to show this slide. It was from one of their meetings where they were synchronizing their Excel sheets. So I guess you have to be a little bit crazy as well to keep it going. So yeah, you need a really good team. And then you have your standard workflows, you have your tools that you're using. And also I have to just say great, it's just really great because it just keeps you on track, and it's really a good way of framework. So we're really also enjoying working with that. And I thought I would just spend a little bit of time going into the details of how we publish our recommendations. So we're using Magic to publish them. So it's a multi-layered format, and the top layer are the recommendations. So you can see here, the example is the dexamethasone that we have, that we're also reviewing at the time as we're speaking. As you can see, it says that we're awaiting recovery, and as you might know, that actually got published. So now we're actually working on this behind the scenes. But this is a top layer that you see when you come into the guideline, and then you can click on more details. So you can see below the recommendation, there's a little remark, and then you have some different tabs. And one of them will take you to the research evidence, where we have our evidence profile, where you can see the numbers, you can see the studies that went into it, how we interpret that outcome, really trying to be transparent about everything here. And then the next one is the key information, or the evidence to decision framework, again, trying to be transparent and just showing how the panel kind of decided on each of those domains, putting that in there. And then also the rationale for the recommendation, so how it all came together. And by the end of the day, you then have your recommendation. Again, this isn't something new. This is what you normally also would do to a guideline. What we felt was really important, since this is a living one, is to be very particular with our version history. So what we do is every time we publish a new version, we put some text in at the beginning, just explaining the changes to the guideline as a whole. And then you can also go down to the individual recommendations and see how they change. So here my example with the dexamethasone isn't so interesting right now. So I also just chose another one for you, and that's on the remdesivir. You can see it's been around for longer. You can see it's been updated at some point in time. And if you want to, you can click in and see the details of what happened. So that's how we try to keep track of everything that changes, and also for the reader to have a chance to go back and see what changed if you're really interested in that. We have already had some students ask us for access to all the old versions. I'm pretty interested to see what comes out of that little study. So is it all just happy days? Well, it's not. We obviously have challenges, and obviously there's things we can do better. So there is sustainability. It's always in our minds, how long can we keep this going for? I mean, we know when the funding runs out, but also just keeping people engaged. And I just have to say right now, people are incredibly engaged. So for this point in time, it's not a problem, but maybe over time, who knows? So it's something that we're really thinking about, how to ensure that people continue to be engaged with the process. And then also the technology that we're using could just also be better. It's really good as it is right now, but I have a wish list. I think we tallied it up to 3 million Australian dollars or something if I wanted everything on my little list. So yeah, there is definitely things that can be better. And then a recent thing that we looked at is that what is evidence? Is a press release evidence? Are preprints evidence? So press releases in our book isn't evidence, but preprints can be if they're good, if we can find the details, that we can assess everything. So yeah, then we're open to using preprints, but it's a case-by-case decision. And then also we're thinking about the end user experience. Right now, it's very much aimed at clinicians, and I'm sure that we could improve it even more, both for clinicians, but also if we were thinking about consumers or patients, that we could do a lot of things, I think, a little bit better than we're doing it right now. So I think that's all of my talk for now. So I am very curious to see if there are some questions, maybe.
Yeah, thank you, Britta, and thank you, Julian, for these great 2 talks. Please chime in and share your questions at the bottom right-hand side. Let me see if we have any questions yet. Okay, at the moment I'm reading for Britta. What is the URL for submitting a question? No. Okay, what's the URL for submitting? Question for Britta. I'm just wondering how many people are working full-time in the project, COVID project.
Oh, that's a really good question. Not many of us are actually working full-time on the project. So many of us are working part-time on it, but I think I have right now in full-time, I guess my team is 5 people, 6 people, just in the evidence room. And then we have project managers, project officers, we have some other people from the outside helping as well. So we have more people than that in the project.
Yeah. People are very impressed by the turnaround of your project, Britta. So they say it's really impressive. Kelvin Hill, it is really, it's impressive. We got Christine with us. Hi, Christine. We cannot hear you. We can't hear you. But it's great that you could join because, okay. No, just another question. Is it really sustainable? Because this turnaround of a weekly turnaround, how are you managing this?
Yeah, so in the beginning, it was a little bit tough because we hadn't done this before and nobody really had done it before. So it took us a little bit of time just to figure out the best workflow. But now I think we're at a stage where I won't say it's routine, but we have a good way of doing it. We know it's a weekly cycle. We know when to do what. But also, I guess as the team grows, you also become aware of that you need to keep everybody informed of what's going on and all of these things. So yeah, it's really an ongoing process where we're learning as we go along, right? So you have growing pains right now, in some extent, also with the new addition of panels. It's always more complicated if you add more panels, obviously. Yeah, so and keeping the panels at a size that are manageable. So yeah. But it's interesting. It is really.
A question for you, Julian. How are you supporting the implementation of your living guideline recommendations? Is it through computable formats? By Mary Nix.
Great question. Yeah, can I also add to the 24-hour turnaround question? So it is 24 hours at that final stage of approval, but because members of or individuals from the member organizations are participating through the process, those organizations will get awareness of the draft recommendation about a week before publication. So it is 1 week, at least for them to be discussing internally or with stakeholders. And also, if we if we don't get consensus, final agreement and consensus, of course, we've got the option in living mode of just pausing and then having further discussion, and then that coming back the following week. In terms of dissemination, so we use Magic for the production and then publication and dissemination of the guideline recommendations. We also have a website that links to that. We have clinical flowcharts that include the recommendations. So we're using that. We have quite an active communication team who are doing a lot of engagement and communication activities. But I think important to note that we don't have any other additional specific knowledge translation activities. And as yet, we don't have structured computable form of our recommendations. We are very interested in that element. So if anyone is keen to collaborate on that, please let us know. We're aware of a lot of great work going on in various parts of the world, including people working on the EBM fire, etc. Those initiatives.
And in relation to technologies, author Julian, we have here a question also from Lucia Kantorova. She would love to know more about what is on your list for improving technologies.
That's Britta's list. I'm sure she could share at some point.
Okay, so the tech that we're using right now mainly is Covidence and Magic, and both of them are really great. I really love them, but they're not particularly built for living. So there's a lot of stuff where I'm thinking we could do it even better. For instance, as we have this turnaround of a week, so we have a version that's out there and it's published. Then we have a version that is in the approval cycle, and then we have a third version that we're working on. And right now, for instance, Magic can't handle that, so we have what we call a mock guideline where we're doing stuff, and then when it's ready to be published, we put it into the real guideline. So it's small stuff like that where it would just be really handy if you could have different layers and versions that you're working on at the same time. But I don't think anybody else has been crazy enough to want it to publish every week. So it's clearly there hasn't been a need until now. So from that point of view, it's also understandable that it's not there yet, the feature, right? Yeah.
Thank you. Good that you mentioned publication, because here we have an expert about the publication of reviews and guidelines. It's Laine, who just joined us. And let's see if the technology is working for us and you're able to present your slides. Christine, can you open your slides? Are you able? We don't hear you. Unmute yourself, maybe.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, now.
Okay.
Are you able to share your screen?
I thought the slides were going to be up on just a minute.
You don't have the set of the slides with you. It's okay. At the end, we had to change the.
I'm opening them up now.
Okay, perfect.
Okay. So.
We see in your screen now.
Okay.
Great.
And
the floor is yours. Thank you.
So I just have to.
Sure, no problem.
My part of the presentation.
A bit further down, there you go.
There you go. First of all, I apologize. This was on my calendar for 8 o'clock. For 8 o'clock Philadelphia time. So what I'll be talking about. So I'll give a little bit of background about Annals of Internal Medicine, the journal that I edit, and talk a little bit about the journal experience during the pandemic, and then talk about how we've begun to experiment with publication of rapid living reviews and guidelines. So about living reviews and guidelines, I'll say a little bit about how we define them from the journal perspective, what information the journal requires them authors to include, and the process and format for updates from ongoing surveillance the evidence, and then talk a little bit about challenges observed during our early experience publishing living guidelines. And this really is early experience. The first one we published was in early May of this year. So Annals' mission is to promote excellence in medicine, enable physicians and other healthcare professionals to be well-informed members of the medical community and society, advance standards in the conduct and reporting of medical research, and contribute to improving the health of people worldwide. So with this mission, systematic evidence reviews and guidelines are a very important component of what we publish. And really at Annals, we see it as even more important than some of the single original research articles that we publish, because it's very unusual that a single study defines high quality effective clinical practice, but systematic evidence reviews definitely do. During the time of coronavirus, we've seen a very large increase in manuscript submissions, pressure for rapid review and publication. We're getting emails every day from people saying, are you interested in this? And then once they submit it, emails twice a day, are you done with the review yet? There's a need for no barriers to information, so that everything that we publish, there's no embargo period, and it's available to the public without a subscription wall. We've seen an explosion of preprints, so it's many of the original research articles that we're getting for peer review, we've initially read about in the newspapers or heard about on in social media. There's been a lot of misinterpretation of preliminary data when reported in preprints, or even not even in preprints, but in press releases. And there's been a need for new dynamic article types to keep pace with the explosion of new information that is coming out of the research enterprise. So this shows manuscript submissions from 2017 to the first half of 2020. And so the red bar shows manuscript submissions from January 1st to June 1st in 2020. And you can see that in one half of the year, we exceeded the total number of manuscripts that we received in 2019. And this is what our editors feel like. We call it the COVID-19 tsunami. We feel like the editors, our peer reviews, our statisticians are in a rickety little boat, and we're being flooded with manuscripts. And we have to review them faster. If we have more manuscripts, we have to review them faster than everybody before. So we offer expedited review of pandemic-related material. If a manuscript is rejected without external review, the authors generally have our decision within 48 hours, often within much less than that. We ask our external reviewers to complete their reviews in 3 to 5 days instead of the usual 10 days. When we think that a submitted work has a very high likelihood of being suitable for publication, we simultaneously conduct our external content and our internal methodologic reviews. When we send our comments or requests for revision to authors, we ask the authors to return the revisions as soon as possible. And once we have the final manuscript, it's scheduled for online publication as soon as it's accepted, and there is no embargo period. So the press doesn't get these articles before the rest of the world. Everybody gets them at the same time. All of the material that we publish in Annals of Internal Medicine is collected in a coronavirus collection. We publish new articles pretty much daily. They're free to the public from the time of publication. We encourage the authors to post them in PubMed Central. As I mentioned, there's no embargo period. And importantly, we encourage authors to share their data with others. And every manuscript that we publish, original research manuscript that we publish, has a reproducible research statement in it where even if the authors are not willing to share their data, their statistical code, and their protocols with others, they have to document that in their article. I mentioned that there's an explosion of preprints, and I'm sure the other presenters also mentioned this. And it's even gotten to the point where it looks like my slides, one of the slides was eliminated, but there's one preprint of an article about preprints. And what Annals' view of preprint servers is they definitely have potential benefits. They avoid delays related to the peer review process. They're freely and widely available to everyone, and it makes the ability for others to act on the findings immediately. But these very same potential benefits are harms. They avoid delays related to the peer review process, so there isn't often time for a careful peer review process. They're available to everybody who can act on them, including patients, clinicians, and policymakers, and sometimes acting on things before they've been adequately vetted can be dangerous, as we've seen with, I guess, the most common example is hydroxychloroquine to treat COVID-19. There are other potential harms. Journals take great care to collect information on potential conflicts of interest of the authors. There's no systematic conflict disclosures required by preprint servers. Often there is no commenting feature, or it's viewable only to the authors. The same work can appear on multiple preprint servers, and there's to date, no systematic indexing. So we've actually seen examples where we've got people have submitted systematic reviews. The same study was reported on 2 preprint servers, and the systematic review authors were counting those as separate studies. So there's obviously a problem there with the care that those systematic reviewers were taking with reviewing the literature, but it really is confusing when you can have multiple versions of the same work in different places. And there's no requirement in preprint servers to link to subsequent peer-reviewed versions of the work. So Annals' policy on preprints is we don't encourage posting on preprint servers, but we don't consider posting on a preprint server prior publication that excludes consideration for publication in Annals. However, if work is posted on a preprint server, it could influence our priority for publication because it may be old news by the time we get to publish it. And if Annals publishes work previously posted as a preprint, we ask the authors to post a link to the peer-reviewed article on the preprint server to the peer-reviewed article on annals.org. So there has been this speed and high volume of research, and while the idea of rapid living articles has been around for several years, Julian and I participated in a session at a GIN meeting several years ago. I think the COVID-19 pandemic has really presented an acute need to operationalize publication, the development and publication of such articles. So the way that the journal defines rapid living reviews and guidelines are that rapid reviews use a simplified systematic review process to produce information quickly. And the living reviews are reviews that are continually updated with evidence as new evidence becomes available. The living review should include explicit predefined decisions on how frequently new evidence is sought and how it's incorporated into the review. And living guidelines are based on living reviews and have analogous methodology for continual updating. Back in May, we published our first rapid living review, and this is an editorial where we specified the information that we expect authors to include in living reviews and living guidelines, and we outlined a plan for how to publish review updates as evidence surveillance continues. This is more complicated than it might seem. If you're posting your living evidence review or your guideline on an institutional website, you can just update it and change it as you wish without, but when they're published in a scholarly journal that is indexed by the National Library of Medicine and other venues, we can't just disappear a prior version. There needs to be careful archiving, and we need to keep links between, and that we want to have links between the related material in the indexing services. So we needed to figure out a way to integrate that into our typical publication process with a lot of care into how the material would be indexed. So this is what we require from authors in the methods of living systematic reviews. They need to tell us how long the updating will continue, the frequency of the updates, the type of evidence that will be eligible for updates. So for example, we've published some living reviews where the initial review considered observational evidence, but the plan was that updates would only look for randomized controlled trials. We strongly encourage registration of living systematic reviews, but often this is a step, the registration step is skipped. We're seeing in order to move things along more quickly. And we want a clear description of any shortcuts taken to enable rapid completion of the review. So this was the first living review that we published by the Evidence-Based Practice Center in Oregon. It looked at the epidemiology and risk factors for coronavirus infection in healthcare workers. In their methods, they described the streamlined review process. They did not register the methods. They limited the search of the gray literature. They did dual review of only 25% of the abstracts. A single reviewer did the data abstraction, and they did not use a formal instrument for critical appraisal. So they specified where they were taking shortcuts from some of the things we all usually look for in the methods of systematic reviews. The challenge comes for updates. We want to have efficient use of journal space and the resources, but we want the articles to be, the updates to be sufficiently comprehensive, published quickly, recognized by indexing service, and linked to the initial review or guideline and to each other, so that when there are multiple updates, the users can go from one to another and know the sequence easily for them. So we didn't want to publish another multi-page 4,000-word clinical guideline every time the evidence is updated, even if there weren't substantive changes in the recommendations or the strength of the recommendations. So this is what we've been doing. If there's a periodic literature surveillance that identifies no new evidence, Annals asks the authors to post a comment to the prior article. So the initial article will be published on annals.org. The authors will post a comment that says that they did conduct an evidence review, but they didn't find any new eligible evidence. So the users know that the surveillance is being conducted, but we're not really taking any, wasting anybody's time or any journal space to let readers know that. If the surveillance identifies new evidence, but that evidence does not alter the substance or strength of the conclusions of the systematic review or the recommendations in the clinical guideline, we publish an update alert that summarizes the new evidence and says that it didn't change the conclusions or the recommendations. And these update alerts are published in the letter section of the journal, and doing that allows them to be linked in indexing services to the initial article. When there's new evidence identified that alters the substance or the strength of the conclusions of the recommendations, then we will negotiate with the authors to publish an entirely new systematic review or clinical guideline. Often this can be shorter because the authors can refer to the methodology in the initial paper. So this is an example of an update of that initial systematic review that I mentioned. Obviously this is too small for people to read it, but it does mention all of the new studies, but says it didn't really change as the last line of this update says the results did not change the conclusions of the original rapid review. There are many challenges to this. So evidence emerges mid-cycle for an update. So we published a living review and accompanying guideline from the American College of Physicians on hydroxychloroquine, and new evidence from a very large observational study was published as the living articles were literally in production. So they were with our compositor ready to go online. We considered putting the articles, we talked with the authors, and we considered putting the articles on hold to update them to include a this newly published very large observational study. But we were glad that we didn't actually put them on hold, because by the next morning, that very large observational study had been retracted. So it's really hard to try to balance being fast enough and not too fast. If we had put that article on hold, we would have gotten the update, the authors updating would have been out of cycle, and then we would have been publishing ourselves a correction or a retraction when this evidence was found to be invalid. So this slide just shows sort of the sequence. So the initial review was published on hydroxychloroquine or chloroquine for treatment or prophylaxis of COVID-19. It was followed by version 1 of a clinical guideline from the American College of Physicians. And then version 2 was an update alert. The recommendations did not change, but there were 6 new studies identified, and the systematic review authors and the guideline authors let the community who's using this evidence know that they did notice those new studies and explained why they didn't change their recommendations. So other challenges of living articles that we've been wrestling with, it's preprints. Should they be included in systematic reviews? And if so, how do you rate the quality of the evidence in a preprint that has not undergone careful vetting? What we're asking the systematic review authors to do is just be very explicit about whether or not they're including preprints, how they're searching for them, and whether they're rating the quality of the evidence reported in a preprint any differently than the quality of the evidence from a peer-reviewed publication. We've been experimenting for formats for the updates. I described what we've been doing so far, but I suspect that as we gain experience with this, we may find better ways to do this. I gave you an example of when seemingly very important evidence emerges in the middle of an update cycle. What do you do? Do you wait for the planned update? And what do you do when it becomes evident that continuing the planned update will be unlikely to yield useful information? So for example, with the hydroxychloroquine evidence review and guideline, the updates were planned to continue monthly for an entire year, but it's already become evident that it's unlikely that the recommendations will change. So those authors are planning to publish an update that says that they have decided to cease the living quality of the work that they're doing. And it's really difficult keeping evidence reviews and guidelines synchronized. So the evidence review needs to be done before the guideline developers can look at the evidence and publish it. And what we're finding, particularly with very short cycle surveillance, so periods of like a month or less, that the evidence reviewers and the guideline developers are sort of tripping over each other's feet, and it's very difficult to to keep the sequence of evidence review rapidly followed by the updated guideline, followed by another evidence review. And if the authors are not preparing the material really almost in real time so that it's ready to be published, the sequence, it's very hard to keep the logical sequence going in the publication. aspects. So I will end there, and happy to take any questions, comments, and particularly suggestions by the people who are listening who have a lot of expertise in this area about better ways that journals might handle this material. And again, there are other journals that publish rapid reviews and living reviews. I only can speak to what Annals' perspective is on this, but we're not the only ones doing this. So thank you.
Thanks a lot, Christine, for your talk. Let's see if we get questions for Christine now. And after a few of them, we can have a debate with the three of you together, sharing the cameras. While we get some questions, Christine, I was wondering, how do groups negotiate with Annals that their work, systematic review or guideline, is actually a living document? And what kind of agreements do you reach with them? Is it something that has to be negotiated up front so that they are tagged as living? And what is the relation?
Yeah, what we found, what we've actually found is a lot of people are submitting reviews, and they're calling it, it used to be that people submitted reviews and they added systematic review to the title. And when you looked at the methods, it really wasn't a systematic review like the ones that people on this call do themselves. And what we found now is people are adding the word living, but there's no plan for updating in their method. So what we look for is we do the peer review process pretty much like we would for any review, but when it's defined as a living review and we're exploring publication, we insist that the authors are very explicit about the timeline for the literature surveillance, and that they are on board with our plan for how we're going to publish the updates, so that they know that they need to post a comment if there's no new evidence. They need to write a short update that'll be published in the letter section if there's new evidence but no change in the conclusion. And if there's substantive new evidence, we may be asking them to prepare another full-length article. So we try to be very, negotiate with authors at the time that we're inviting them we're letting them know that we're interested in publishing the work.
Okay, thanks. Another question from Amir Qasim is about the frequency of updating. So even if data is coming frequently, is it better to have some breathing room to ensure published research has been seen and digested a bit by the readers?
I think that's what we're seeing. So some of the early living reviews were specifying monthly surveillance with monthly updates, and it's very quick. And you do get into, and I think one of the problems with that very quick cycle is the clinical guideline developers need time to look at the update and decide whether they need to change anything and formulate their recommendations. So I think any quicker than a month, I think is going to prove to be infeasible. And I think particularly when the evidence reviews are including preprints, there is some value in giving a little breathing time and letting the research play out in the real world, so that it can be vetted and everybody can have a better sense of the strengths and limitations of that work. So I think if you're doing a systematic review on congestive heart failure, I don't think anybody wants to be doing the surveillance monthly. It probably would just be a waste of people's time and resources. The pandemic changes things, but I think even in the setting of the pandemic, any quicker than monthly, and we've had some groups who said they were going to do it monthly, and now they're rethinking and they're going to do it every 3 months.
Okay, That makes more sense, yeah. Julian and Britta, can you share your cameras and then we can have a full panel discussion, please? And we have here
questions.
questions.
Answering questions.
We are not short of questions. So here's a question for any of you. So anyone aware of efforts to coordinate the prioritization and collaboration to tackle guidance topics across jurisdictions in order to better use available resources?
It's a great question. Britta, do you want to start with that?
I can start. I know the WHO is doing some work, and I think there's a lot of groups across the globe actually that are trying to do it. I know Cochrane also just does it. I think Covenant as well is also trying to coordinate. Yeah, so there are definitely people aware of redundancy, and many people are doing the same things, so which is kind of not the best way forward. So yeah.
What about at journal level, Christine? Any chance of or any room for coordination between top journals? Is there a point or?
Well, coordination being, I mean, it depends on what you mean by coordination. I think it probably is not for the same things to be published simultaneously in other journals. That's something that neither Annals nor any of the other journals really has an interest in doing. It's a little bit wasteful, particularly when material that we're publishing is out and it's free to everybody. So it's not like you're going to reach different, give access to different audiences by publishing in multiple venues. But, you know, we are seeing, you know, there have been, we've seen just submitted to Annals on some of the topics related to COVID-19, you know, literally more than a dozen systematic reviews on exactly the same topic. Not all of them are connected with guideline groups, but it does seem like there is, you know, there is a lot of duplication of effort. And I don't know, you know, by the time a manuscript is submitted to the journal, it's almost too late for those groups to coordinate their efforts because they've all kind of done their process and in their minds completed their work. So, you know, I would hope if there's, you know, one of the reasons for registration of the methods is that then people can go and see who else is doing this, and does it make more sense for us to collaborate with them than to do our own review.
I just add, I'm not sure if Britta, you mentioned, I was responding to a chat question, but I think COVID end collaboration that Jeremy Grimshaw and John Lavis are running out of McMaster is a great example of working towards more coordinated response. But I think as a community, we have to own the fact that we haven't really solved this problem during this pandemic yet. We still, as Christine just highlighted, we still have an enormous amount of duplication going on.
Okay. Regarding also avoiding waste of resources, what about adaptation of recommendations? Are you working on facilitating, you know, because you are big players here, especially maybe you in Australia, of facilitating other groups to adapt or adopt your work?
You go, Britta.
Yeah, so we're really trying to make it easy to steal our stuff, and we are also talking to some people who have expressed interest in doing it. And we also try to steal as much as we can. So when we get a question, our first thought isn't, oh, now we need to do a review from scratch. We start by looking if somebody else has already done that review, and then we use that review instead of doing our own. So yeah, And also we have our living guidelines with recommendations that change very rapidly, but we also have our flowcharts, so clinical flowcharts for recommendations where they're really important still, but they might not be suitable for living because maybe the evidence base doesn't change much. And for those, we've adapted recommendations from other places as well, because there wasn't a reason to develop them de novo. But we just really felt they were necessary to have there to give the full picture instead of just the living recommendations.
Yeah, and just a note, we're in the process of trying to make as much of our data available as possible through the website. So if anyone's interested, you can just contact us directly, but the intent is that we'll get things set up so that all the data that underpins the systematic reviews will be free and open through the website as well.
Great. Another question now from Kelvin Hill about peer review, given in the context of COVID guidelines, given that things change potentially weekly. Can you talk about, any of you, about peer review process? What are the implications?
Yeah, so there's two levels here because we're going for approval by the Australian body that approves guidelines. So we get that stamp. So they're going to do the whole official peer review very traditionally as you do. But then we also have the guidelines that are constantly an open public peer review. So you can always just write us an email, but also you can go into Magic. And then if there's a particular recommendation that you want to comment on, you can just add a comment and we will then respond to it. We've had people saying, oh, you flipped something in your evidence profile, or I really disagree with the way that, so that's a really nice way also to interact with the audience. That's one thing where I want some improvement in our tech, because right now, unfortunately, every time you update to a version, the previous comments get a little bit hidden and aren't front and center anymore. So that's one of the things that we want to improve on as well, that you can better see the history of the comments that have been made on different recommendations.
Yeah, and just to highlight the Australian National Health and Medical Research Council that I mentioned earlier, which is the approval body Britta mentioned, have been amazing working with us on this journey towards, you know, a much more dynamic updating process than obviously has been the general case previously.
Any insights from the journal side, Christine?
Yeah, well, so to date, the living guidelines that we've published have been from the American College of Physicians, which is the organization that owns and publishes the journal. So that increases our ability to sort of collaborate. And what we've been doing is that the guideline will go to the journal for our journal peer review at the same time that it's going to the board of the American College of Physicians to approve the guidelines, so that the guideline developers can sort of integrate all the feedback at one time instead of sequentially. And that has helped speed up the process a little bit. You know, typically what would happen is they would not submit the guideline to the journal until it had been approved by the American College of Physicians. But that, you know, creates delay, because particularly then if the peer reviewers identified something really substantive that needed to change, then it would need to go back to the board for approval. This way, it can all happen at the same time. And we've been lucky that, you know, I think people are increasingly getting tired, but at least at the beginning of the pandemic, our peer reviewers were I guess everybody was stuck at home. Everybody was very good about returning their reviews, you know, within 24 hours. I think people are getting tired. It's a little bit harder to find people willing to do those very quick reviews these days.
And another question, in this case from Wanderley, maybe also to both of you, but maybe a bit provocative. Do you think, because you are invested, but do you think that the changes in COVID-19 diagnosis and therapeutics that you are seeing are so great that they deserve a lot of effort in leaving systematic review guidelines?
Well, of course, we're going to answer yes to that question. Yeah, I mean, I think when we started this endeavor, the purpose was really to try and create a single, coherent, trusted voice for Australian clinicians. In March, we were aware that we were already in a situation where we had multiple specialist societies issuing various pieces of guidance and statements, and a lot of, really an enormous amount of wasted effort with people doing site-specific protocols. So I think to a large extent we have avoided some of the worst consequences of that. And I think, we all know that the evidence is moving very quickly. And so we're doing more formal evaluations, but certainly the anecdotal feedback is that people greatly appreciate the fact that we have brought all the societies together, so we are speaking as one voice, so that we reduce that confusion. And also just that sense that there's, rigorous methodology underpinning things, combined with the fact that they know it's up to date. And people know how quickly the evidence is coming out. Of course, they're on Twitter, they see media releases, preprints, publications, etc. I think what they like to see is that that's reflected quite quickly in the guidelines, and anecdotally, I think helps to improve the engagement and trust around that. But we'll see if that plays out in the evaluation.
Thank you. Do you have the impression, that's another question from Lisa Haskell, the impression that living guidelines are able to integrate patient perspectives, or are they being neglected?
So I can only speak for the American College of Physicians process. So their guideline group has a patient representative, and that person participates in this process the same way that they would with other, with other guidelines. So I don't think there's, if that perspective is provided by somebody who's on the committee, I suppose it's easier because there probably isn't time for it to go out for public comment to a larger community, if that's the process that's used to integrate the public perspective. So I think it can be done as long as the people providing that perspective are able to do it quickly.
I provided a brief chat response to Lisa's question. I know we're over time, so I'll keep it brief, but yeah, we have established a consumer panel in collaboration with the Australia's Consumer Health Forum, which is the peak health consumer body here. I would say at the moment it's a work in progress. We've got a great panel, very engaged, but the weekly cycles obviously is not a kind of traditional context in which you'd be working with a consumer panel. So we're still working out the best model for that that engagement.
Okay, given that we started a little bit later, if you're okay, let's take another couple of questions. And a quick one, accountability here, about the evaluation of the living guidelines. What kind of evaluation are you doing with your living guideline process?
Do you want to do that, Britta?
Yes, sure. Okay, so we're doing a process evaluation right now ongoing. So every month there's a survey sent out to members who are involved. We also have what we call the monthly confession room, where some of us are interviewed about how it's going. And then we're also right now planning or is it out? I have been on vacation 1 week, so I actually don't know if it's out, but we've planned a bigger survey for health practitioners out there to get their input. And then, yeah, so I think that's some of the things that we're working on right now. And I'm sure I forgot some of it, Julian, because it's not me doing it.
I think the only other thing to add is that we've established an observational data working group. So building partnerships with custodians of large observational data sets, where we'll be looking at, again, more dynamic way of monitoring healthcare practice, and obviously then looking at the concordance between that practice and our specific recommendations. Of course, there's always that challenge of attributing causation to our guidelines per se, but at least we'll be able to look at that association in addition to the other mechanisms that Britta just described.
Okay, maybe a final one about supplemental information in guidelines. How much of the supplemental do you update with each version? in addition to the evidence review and recommendation development, how do you reconcile the non-evidence, non-recommendation information in the guideline? Or is it only the recommendation statement and evidence review that gets updated from the net standpoint?
That one I can answer. So we have our key information, right? So sometimes it's the availability of a treatment that changes, and then we update that. Sometimes it's maybe we found some evidence on acceptability of the drug that changed. So many small pieces can change that aren't necessarily evidence per se. So we will change whatever needs to be changed. And also in the same line, we have some recommendations right now where we've made a PCAR question. We searched, there's just no evidence yet. We know it's coming. So in the meanwhile, we made some consensus recommendations. And those we also open up on a regular basis to see if they're still current and if they're still up to date as well. So it's not just the evidence, it's everything that can change around it as well to make us want to look at the recommendation again.
Thanks. Well, I think, well, we've gone 7 minutes over the hour. Unless you have further reflections, any of you three you want to make, we could call it a day.
That's great. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I think if anyone wants any more information, happy to just send us an email.
Yes.
And we're very eager for suggestions about how to do this better, because the way we've launched this, we very much see as an experiment and a pilot.
I just have to add, Christine, I think you're an amazing innovator to take this on. It's great. We know that there's many constraints in the current model for publication. No, it's great.
Well, thanks very much to all of you for your great presentations and the debate we have. Thanks everybody for attending the seminar. Remember that has been recorded and we uploaded in the COVID-19 webpage, GENE webpage. And please answer our survey that you will be receiving after the seminar. Thanks very much, everybody. Bye-bye now.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.